Hello, my name is Jason Farquhar and I want to talk about some work which is predominantly done by my PhD student, Yvonne Blockland, in collaboration with Jürgen Brun, who works at the University Medical Center in Nijmegen, who's an anesthesiologist, and Luciana Spira, who is a postdoc while we did this work. And I want to talk about essentially attempted, executed or imagined movements, which is best for BCI. And the reason I want to talk about this is because when we think about our potential users, something that's very apparent quite early on is that most of our potential users would want to or would try to use attempted movements. So for example, if we think of a coma patient and we're trying to detect when they become aware, the first thing they naturally do is try and move their limbs to attract the attention of their carer or their caregiver. If we think of another similar scenario, which is actually what this work was built on, we have someone who's going into an operating theatre under general anaesthetic and worst case scenario, they wake up, they become aware. The first thing we know from anecdotal reports they try to do is they try to move. They try to shout, they try to make someone aware that they're aware. And so what they do is they attempt to move, but the movements are inhibited because of, for example, their injury or their damage or for some other reason. And what we thought was actually if you contrast that to what happens in the BCI experiment, we take a healthy user in and what do we tell them to do? We say something like, imagine the feeling of moving as vividly as possible without moving. And there's clearly a disconnect there. There's some reason we ask them to do imagination. And strangely, if you look through the literature, what you see is actually it's unclear why we do it that way. In the literature, you sort of tend to have three sort of reasons that no one really says this is why we do imagination. So either we do it because imagined moving subjects, they look like they're paralyzed. They don't move. They look like they're frozen in place. Or because they're not physically movement, we don't get the confines of the artifacts. So we can show that it's based on a brain signal because there's no potential confines of movement. Or, which is probably the most scientific reason, because the original papers by Farquhar and research since have all shown that imagined movement activates the motor cortex in a similar way to actual movement. So effectively we use imagined movements because they're sort of a proxy for paralyzed patients in the healthy population. But what's actually also clear is that there are other ways that we can inhibit movement. We can do other ways to be proxy of paralyzed attempted movements. So in this case, we have here sort of just a very, very iconic representation of normal executed movement. So something starts in the motor cortex, you have an intention to move, goes through supplemental motor cortex, down to the brainstem, into the central nervous system, down the spine, to the muscle contracts, you move, you get your feedback and you close the loop. So that's conventional motor execution. I'm just going to skip ahead for time. And what you can see is actually we have a couple of options available to us. So what we can do is what we classically do, movement imagination. So movement imagination, exactly how the movement is inhibited is actually relatively unclear, but what we know is somewhere in cortex there's an active process inhibiting the motor output. So the movement gets blocked somewhere in motor cortex. A movement attempt, actually it gets blocked in different places for different diseases or for different reasons. So a movement attempt, if you have a spinal cord injury, the movement is blocked in the spinal cord. If you have general anesthetic, like a neuromuscular block, the movement gets blocked at the connection between the motor neurons and the muscle. If you have paralysis induced, for example, with cortical stroke or ALS, the movement gets blocked somewhere up in cortex. So with attempted movement, it's sort of blocked somewhere here. And you can already see movement imagination is different. It's stopping a little bit further up. We also have the option of doing isometric movements or quasi-movements. In that case, movement is happening the whole way down to the muscles, but the muscle contractions are so small there's no actual physical movement. So we can also do a blocking down here. And so the question that we had was, okay, we have different ways of doing this. What is best? So we formulated that in two questions. And we did two experiments effectively to answer them. The first question was, for a paralyzed user, should they do motor attempt or motor imagination? And the second question being, if we have a healthy user and we're trying to simulate a paralyzed user doing their thing, should we use motor execution, imagination, attempt, or isometric movements? And so to answer these, we did two experiments. So I don't want to go into the details of the experiment, but you feel free to ask about them. But experiment 1 was which type of movement is better for paralyzed users. What we did was a controlled study with 9 paralyzed patients, a spinal cord injury, high level. And I want to emphasize the long-term paralyzed patients. So the minimum was 11 years, the maximum was 40 years, average 25 years post-paralysis, and 12 age-matched controls. And we asked them to do a task. So they would do 12 seconds of finger flexion, and then stop, and then 12 seconds of imagination, or for the healthy users, actual movement versus imagination. And for analysis, we measured EEG over the motor cortex with 8 EEG channels, and we looked for the classic signature of movement, which is an ERD-ERS pair over the motor cortex. And specifically here, we looked for 8 to 24 hertz reduction in power during movement, during the movements, and we analyzed in 3-second pieces. And in order to assess the strength of the effect, we trained a classifier to try and distinguish no movement from movement. To jump straight into the results, what we see is a classical signature. So in our healthy controls, which are these guys, over the motor cortex, blue is a reduction in power, red is an increase in power. During the movement, we get an ERD, reduction in power, post-movement ERS. And what we see very clearly in our healthy controls, no real surprises. Movement execution is a stronger effect than movement imagination. This is fairly well known from literature, and no one's not hugely surprised by that. For our patients, and again I want to emphasize, is a long-term paralyzed, 12 years plus, we see something quite similar. For movement attempt, so they're trying to move, but they can't because of the paralysis, we get a stronger ERD and a stronger ERS than under imagination. So that's sort of interesting in itself. So even after long-term paralysis, the patient still knows the difference between attempt and imagination. There's still a difference in their head. And for our BCI research, they should be doing movement attempt. It's a stronger signal. So that seems fairly clear. And when we look at the classification results, you see exactly the same thing. For both the patients, which is here, just look at the mean, and the controls, performance under attempt for the patients or under execution for the controls is much stronger. Classification performance is significantly stronger than if we do imagination. So our conclusion is, which movement is better for paralyzed patients? Paralyzed users should use movement attempt to maximize their cortical activation and maximize their BCI control. That's clear. So the second question was, which type of movement is most similar to movement attempt in healthy users? So for this, we had to do something a little bit more sophisticated. So we had to take our healthy users and we had to paralyze them. And the way we did that was, conveniently, we had an anesthesiologist on the team. We got him to anesthetize them. We took them into the OR. We got them to do movement execution, movement imagination, and isometric movements. We put a tourniquet on, we injected them, we froze the limb, and got them to do motor attempt afterwards. So for these patients, this is a within-subject analysis where they did the actual movement and then 20 minutes later they did the movement attempt. So it's as close as we could get to saying the same person under paralysis. Similar to the first study, we analyzed EEG over the motor cortex. We looked for the ERD. And in this case, because the specific question was which movement is most similar to motor attempt, we did a transfer learning thing. So we trained the classifier on either execution, imagination, or isometric, and tried to see how well it did when classifying no movement versus attempted movements in the same subjects. Again, just looking at the ERD-ERS pairs, we see sort of what we expect. This is movement execution. This is the one we care about, attempted movements, and this is isometric movements. And it's very clear, movement execution, strongest responses, big ERD, big ERS. Interestingly, movement attempt is actually pretty strong. It's much stronger than movement imagination. And actually, isometric movement looks visually quite similar. So that would sort of say maybe isometric movement is a better thing than imagined movement. When we look at the classification results, actually they say pretty much the same thing. If we train on movement execution and test a movement attempt, the performance is statistically not different to if we just do movement attempt. The same for the isometric. The motor imagination is significantly worse. It's only 4 subjects, but it's still 99.9% significant. So there's a big difference in classification performance movement imagination versus movement attempt. So our conclusion from this is, for healthy users, we should use movement execution or isometric movements when we're trying to simulate movement attempt after paralysis. Which then brings me to our main conclusion for question 1. Should paralyzed users use movement attempt or movement imagination? They should use movement attempt. And for healthy users, when we're trying to simulate paralysis, we should use movement execution or isometric movements. There is one sort of caveat to this statement, which is in this case, I said there's different ways of preventing movement. We use neuromuscular block, and that blocks the movement quite far down the pathway. So this is just before the muscles. If you want to simulate a paralysis which is induced further up, for example in cortex, because of cortical stroke or ALS, this may not be the case, but at least for these cases, it's clear that we should be using isometric movements or movement execution. Yeah, so that's it. My main conclusion. BCI researchers should focus on attempted movements rather than imagined movements, because pretty much for every case, imagined movements are not the ideal solution. That was it. Thank you. Our questions. Do we have any questions? Yeah.
So in your experiment in healthy people, you inject blood injection, so okay, there is really no movement. But do you think that somebody who is healthy, doesn't have injection, is really capable of replicating this, or you will have always activation of proprioceptors, which you don't have in paralyzed people? It's inevitable to have activation of proprioceptors in healthy people.
I agree. I agree. So I'm not saying that there's not additional stuff happening. What I'm saying is that when we do the analysis and we try and see in these cases, which are not exactly the same as true paralysis, which one is most similar to paralysis, what we find is that the motor execution, the brain states, as assessed by the visual plots or by the classifiers, are most similar to the attempt. It's clear they're not exactly the same, but they're the most similar that we can do, and they're definitely more similar than imagination.
Right, because we did study, we measured with ultrasound movement and with EMG, and we noticed that people, when they say that they have very vivid kinesthetic imagination, you actually have lots of twitches in the muscle. It's not really like in paralyzed
So I
people.
didn't present the results here, but we also have similar results where if you measure EMG under imagination, you see there is muscle activity. I mean, even imagination isn't really pure imagination. It's not completely blocked, which is another argument for saying if it's already happening, why don't we do something more like isometric movements, which also has some other advantages?
Okay, thanks.
I think it's important to keep in mind that the purpose of doing sensory motor rhythm training for a brain-computer interface is to gain control over the mu rhythm or the beta rhythm, and not necessarily to produce the best classification offline. Generally at the Wadsworth Center, we consider motor imagery as an initial strategy, but successful training involves the control becoming automatic, and hence it's not dependent either on movement or movement imagery. The person just wills it to occur. I suspect that if we try to train people using movement, that they're not going to learn this automaticity. They're going to keep relying on actually doing movement.
Yep, I agree. Again, I think that's a fair point. And that's a slightly different objective in terms of you're trying to train them to get an additional control modality effectively, direct control of the brain signature. I guess what I'm saying here is if we were trying to use them to simulate paralyzed users, which is what a lot of us do in the lab because we use healthies because they're more readily accessible, in that case, these types of movements are a better simulation. So it's a slightly different objective, I think, in the end.